in today's section is our fourth section of Getting into the Weeds webinar series. And this year, our topic is farming in a humid year to reflect our weather event and production challenge last year. And the fourth section, why herbicide fail, targeting effective herbicide application. We have Dr. Peter Sikkema with us, and I will give a quick introduction about him later on. For those of you who missed our last three sections, you are able to go to our Perennial's YouTube channel. Just simply search Getting into the Weeds section 3, and you are able to see all our season 3 sections from the last three sections. We also have season 1 and 2 if you would like to review or to listen to it. Okay. All right, just have a couple Zoom housekeeping information. So all your audio and video will be turned off during the webinar, but make sure your name display on the Zoom matches your pesticide license name. To do that, you can just click on your picture and right-click your picture and change the name. And if you'd like to ask a question, please use the Q&A feature at the bottom of your screen. But also keep eyes on the chat function, because I'm going to send out the pesticide points and post-service survey links for you to figure out to get your points and also get some feedback from you about our section today. And today I have my colleague Talia Plaskett, our protected crop specialist, with me, and she's going to help me with the chats and all the Q&A. So please send the question in, and we will address all the questions at the end of the section. So a little bit about Perennial. Perennial is a multi-phase company serving food and beverage products from field to fork. This workshop is the fourth section of the third season of our Getting into the Weeds. So by our agricultural service team, sections like this are part of our extension program. So we develop workshops, other trainings, as well as offer production advice in field disease and pest identification management advice, and to help you to address emerging and critical industry issues and help producers be more environmentally and economically sustainable. Okay, we also have other services in the company. For example, quality and food safety, product development, lab services, and fisheries. And okay, here's the favorite slide by everybody, pesticide points. So in order to get your credit for this section, each participant needs to watch on their own device. So if you are watching with your friend, please log in with another device. If you have trouble doing that, you should still contact me and we'll see if we can figure out a way, but please watch on your own device. And the link will be posted in the chat later on to go to the survey for you to fill out your name and pesticide numbers and other information to get your points. So when you finish the survey, you must print the screen and submit it when you apply to renew your certification. I know some of you maybe have trouble doing that, so please contact me or other specialists you contact regularly, and we will try to help you. For those of you getting CCA points, you can scan this barcode to log in, and it will take you to the page to get your points. And this barcode will be shown after the presentation. So if you don't have a chance to do it now, we can show this barcode again. All right. Okay, I'm just going to do a quick introduction about Dr. Peter Sikkema. So he's a professor in the University of Guelph Ridgetown campus. Dr. Sikkema's research program focuses on the development of precision weed management programs in field crops. And as I just introduced, he has a great weed science short course. If anybody likes to take, please contact him and he will give you more detailed information. So in this section, Dr. Sikkema will introduce why herbicide fail and how to achieve effective herbicide application result in your weed management. Okay, so very quick introduction. I'm just going to give as much time as possible to Dr. Sikkema because I know he's going to tell you some very valuable information for your farm management. Okay, Dr. Sikkema, I'm going to share my screen and then you can share your presentations and start that, okay?
Sounds good, Hugh.
Okay.
I'm going to hit share screen now.
Yeah.
And do you see my first slide, Hugh?
Yeah, very clear. And I see your laser point as well there.
And so I just went down to the second slide and back up to the first. Hi, everyone. It's my privilege to just address the topic of why do registered herbicides fail? So in this opening slide, you'll see a winter wheat field with giant ragweed escapes, soybean with perennial sow thistle, volunteer corn, lamb's quarters, horse nettle, and cocklebur. And I think in every one of these situations, you can be assured that those farmers applied a herbicide and they were really disappointed in the level of weed control on their farm. So they could have spent $20, $30, or $40 an acre and did not get commercially acceptable weed control. So the question is why do herbicides fail even after farmers spend this much money on weed management? And so I think poor weed control is influenced by 6 different categories of reasons. The first one would be extremes in weather. The second one would be variations in soil characteristics. Number 3 is weed specifics, the wrong application timing, application or seeding problems, and finally, you may have just simply selected the wrong herbicide for the weed spectrum in each individual field. And so I'm going to go through each one of these 6 categories in more detail in my presentation today. So in terms of extremes in weather, it could be that you got too little rain. It could be too much rain. It could be that it's too hot and dry, or you got rain too soon after application. So let me go into a little more detail on all 5 of those reasons. In terms of too little rain, with pre-emergence herbicides, they require rainfall to dissolve the herbicide in soil water solution so that it can be taken up by the weed seedlings. And we in weed science refer to that as herbicide activation. And if no rainfall occurs within 7 to 10 days after application, weed control may be reduced. And so if you look in the pictures on the right-hand side of the screen, notice here, this is poor green foxtail control with Frontier. And in the bottom right, it's poor lamb's quarters control with Clisto. I want to say immediately, I think Frontier and Callisto are good herbicides. But in these 2 experiments, and they were conducted in my research program, there was no activating rainfall after application. The herbicide does not get dissolved in soil water solution. It's not taken up by the developing weed seedling, and you end up with poor control. And so if you don't get rainfall after the application of a pre-emergence herbicide, you can expect reduced weed control with almost all soil applied herbicides. And generally speaking, on the product labels, it will say if that occurs that you should use a shallow cultivation or rotary hoeing to uproot those small weed seedlings that have escaped the treatment. Just to show you some data to support what I just said, this is some research from a previous graduate student in my program. Her name is Andrea Smith. And here she was looking at annual grass control with Prowl. The black bar graphs is where there was more than 4/10 to 8/10 of an inch or 10 to 20 millimeters of rain within 1 week of application. And notice the weed control was between 78 and 97%. So that's pretty good weed control with the soil applied application of Prowl. What I really want you to take note of though in this bar graph is if you look at the gray bar graphs, that's where we got less than 4/10 of an inch or 10 millimeters of rain in the 7 days after application. And notice the control decreased from 78 to 54% for foxtail. And across those 4 annual grasses, the control was between 54 and 79%. And in most situations, that would be considered not commercially acceptable. And the reason is lack of rain to activate that herbicide. In contrast to that, you could get too much rain. And so excessive rain after the application of a soil-applied herbicide may leach a portion of the herbicide below the weed seed germination zone. And I'm going to just give you an example, and it's reduced weed control with soil-applied herbicides such as dicamba. This happens to be one of our most challenging weeds in Ontario. It is water hemp. And here you can see the amount of water hemp in the control plot. And in this study, which was done by Brittany Hedges, a previous graduate student of mine, she applied dicamba and notice the disappointing control with dicamba. Dicamba is a really small molecule. It forms a negatively charged ion in the soil. The soil has a negative charge, so the herbicide stays in soil water solution. And if you get excessive rain, it just moves the herbicide below the weed seed germination zone in the soil, and you end up with poor weed control. Really interesting, in this manuscript published by Christopher Lando in 2021, they did a really comprehensive analysis of a lot of data from the University of Illinois. And these scientists, they concluded that climate change is predicted to result in an increase in soil temperatures, which I think all of us agree with. And because of that increase in soil temperature, they predict that there will be more rapid herbicide degradation due to photodegradation, chemical and microbial degradation. And they've shown in their research that this will result in reduced weed control with soil-applied herbicides because they break down more quickly if you have a really hot summer. Now going on to post-emergence herbicides. During periods of drought, it's more difficult for the herbicide to cross the cuticle and enter the living portion of the plant. And the reason is during periods of drought, that weed is trying to conserve moisture. The way that it does that is it increases the thickness of the cuticle on the leaf surface, and it's more difficult for a herbicide to cross the cuticle if it's thicker and get into the living portion of the plant. And also under low relative humidity, it reduces cuticle hydration. There's just fewer pathways for the herbicide to cross the cuticle and get into the living portion of the plant. And the spray droplets dry out more quickly. And both of those result in reduced herbicide absorption. And you end up with reduced weed control with almost all post-emergence herbicides. So this is some really interesting research that was done by Waldecker and Weiss at the University of Minnesota. Here they were working with the herbicide glyphosate or Roundup, and they showed that under adequate moisture, 44% of applied glyphosate was absorbed by common milkweed. Really interesting in these controlled environment experiments that they did, where they put the milkweed under drought stress, the amount absorbed went from 44 to 29%. So there's a 15% decrease in glyphosate absorption due to drought. And in the same experiment, they also looked at the translocation of glyphosate, and they reported a 13% decrease in glyphosate translocation due to drought. Where there was adequate moisture, 20% of the absorbed glyphosate was translocated throughout the plant. And where there was drought conditions, that was reduced to 7%. And then a different weed scientist, this is Cal Messersmith at North Dakota State University. They were looking at velvet leaf control in a controlled environment experiment. Under adequate moisture, glyphosate provided 95% control of velvet leaf. And notice the decrease in control under drought conditions to 60% with the same herbicide at the same rate. And finally, in terms of weather, you could get rain too soon after application, and rainfall shortly after application of post herbicides may wash the herbicide off, resulting in reduced control. I think that's pretty self-explanatory, and I think most people would appreciate that. And if you look at the rain-free period requirement for various herbicides, I took this out of the Ontario Weed Control Guide in Ontario, and you can see that Reglone or Diquat, man, it gets into the plant really fast, and it only has a 15-minute rain-free period requirement. In contrast to that, something like Roundup has a 1-hour rain-free period requirement, and I put a red box around Blazer, Basgran, and Sencor. Man, these herbicides have a quite long rain-free period requirement from anywhere from 6 to 8 hours. The next reason why you could get poor weed control with herbicides is just differences in soil characteristics. So most soil applied herbicides are absorbed to the clay and organic matter, and the herbicide rate should be adjusted depending on soil type and organic matter content. And I think most weed management practitioners know that you have to use a higher rate of a soil applied herbicide on a clay-based soil compared to a sandy soil. And it's simply because you have more binding sites for the herbicide in a clay soil than you do in a sandy soil. And you get reduced weed control with herbicides that are tightly absorbed to clay and organic matter. And many herbicide labels have restrictions on where you can apply their herbicide. Broad Strike, really interesting to me. It says that you shouldn't use this herbicide on soils with more than 5% organic matter. I grew up on a dairy and hog farm in South Central Ontario. My brother and nephew still farm that land where I grew up. Almost every field on their farm has quite a bit higher than 5% organic matter. Based on the label, my brother could not use Broad Strike for weed control in his corn because his organic matter is more than 5% in every field on their farm. And other labels have restrictions based on organic matter. Callisto, you can't apply it if there's more than 10%. And Dual says do not use on muck soils. This is some really interesting data that I got from FMC. Here they're looking at velvet leaf control with sulfentrazone, and it's showing the impact of cation exchange capacity. And the reason why I chose this slide is cation exchange capacity is kind of a combination of texture, so sand versus clay soil, and it's a combination of organic matter and pH. So it combines all of those things. Anyways, if you have a cation exchange capacity of less than 5 with sulfentrazone or authority, you would get 95% control of velvet leaf. Isn't it interesting, as you increase the cation exchange capacity, you could say you're going from a sand to a clay soil. You could say you're going from low organic matter to high organic matter, or low pH to high pH. You'd all be right. Anyways, the point that I want to make is as you go from a low cation exchange capacity soil to a high, you can see that the control was decreased by 33%. And that's the impact of soil characteristics on the biological activity of herbicides. Really interesting to me is that soil pH also affects herbicide activity. And so for some soil applied herbicides, not all, soil pH affects the ionization properties. And my guess, for those of you who don't remember your chemistry course from high school or university, this may be new to you, but that simply means that some herbicides protonate or deprotonate depending on soil pH. And I think I probably still confused you, but hopefully I'll show you this example. So if you look at 2,4-D, if you have low pH soil, you have a hydroxyl molecule right over here. And when the pH goes up, you can see it releases that hydrogen atom or that proton. And so you go from a neutral molecule in terms of its electrical charge to a negative molecule in terms of its negative charge. Remember that the soil has a negative charge. And so if you have a negatively charged herbicides, those the soil and the herbicide are repelled. The herbicide stays in soil water solution, and you're going to get better weed control at low pH than you are at high pH. And so probably the best example in Ontario is the impact of soil pH with Sencor or Metribuzin. It would follow the exact same response that I showed with 2,4-D over here. And so Sencor forms cations in the soil at low pH. Those cations are bound by the soil and you get poorer weed control. In contrast to that, if you had a high pH soil, Sencor is repelled by the soil colloids, it stays in soil water solution, and you get better weed control. This is the best data I've ever seen on the impact of soil pH on the biological activity of a herbicide. It was done by Brian Jinks and George Kagodi at North Dakota State University. In this research, they're looking at biennial wormwood control with broadstrike or flumetzilam. Notice where you had a high pH, 7.8, broadstrike provided 100% control of biennial wormwood. In contrast to that, where the soil pH was 6.5, the control was 85%. And notice where the pH was 5.4, the control decreased to 45%. Just a dramatic effect of soil pH on the biological activity of that herbicide. So now we'll move on to the third category, and that is weed specifics. So in terms of weed specifics, probably the most important thing is the difference in cuticle composition among various weed species. So the cuticle varies in composition and thickness among weed species, as well as during the growing season. Generally, thinner cuticles are more permeable to herbicides, which results in greater herbicide absorption and therefore improved herbicide efficacy. And generally, younger plants have thinner cuticles, they have less developed cuticles, and that's why you get improved weed control when you spray your herbicide early in the growing season. This is just some amazing data on the cuticle composition among 5 different weed species. So you can see there's velvet leaf, green foxtail, barnyard grass, Canada fleabane, and common ragweeds. And this is just the epicuticular wax content in micrograms per square meter. Notice that velvet leaf doesn't have very much cuticle on that leaf surface, right? It's only 10. In contrast to that, lamb's quarters has 28 times as much epicuticular wax on the leaf surface. And that could be one of the reasons why lamb's quarters is more difficult to control on your farm, simply because it has a greater wax content on the leaf surface. It's hard for the herbicide to cross that waxy layer and get into the living portion of the plant. The next thing we'll talk about is weed density. In fields with extremely heavy weed pressure, control may not be commercially acceptable. And many of the herbicide manufacturers know this. And I just took these statements straight off of the dual, atrazine, steadfast, and Shield-X label. On the dual label, it says, use the higher rate for heavier weed populations. On the atrazine label, it says, use the higher rate for heavy weed infestations. On the steadfast label, it says, use higher rates for dense weed populations. And on the Shield-X label, it says, use the higher rate for heavier weed infestations is recommended. And I agree with all of those labels. If you have heavy weed pressure on your farm, don't compromise on the rate. And assuming that you have a wide margin of crop safety with your crop, I would definitely move up the herbicide rate in those fields with heavier weed pressure. This is some research that was done by a previous graduate student of mine. His name's Christian Wilms. And notice in his research, he had about 70 water hemp plants per square meter compared to 700. And so just think the gray bar graphs have 10 times as high weed pressure, where there was low weed pressure with the herbicides Converge, Primextra, Integrity, and Acuron. Look at the weed control is 97 to 99%. If that was your farm, I'm quite sure you would be really happy with the level of weed control. What's really interesting to me, though, is using the exact same herbicides in fields with heavy weed pressure, and your control goes down to 77 to 94%. And so with Converge and Primextra, my guess is you're not going to be happy with the weed control if you chose to use those herbicides in fields with heavy weed pressure. In terms of weed species, weed control is going to be influenced by the time of germination and emergence. And some weeds germinate late in the spring or early summer, or they germinate over an extended period of time. This is some really interesting research. It was done by Mike Shriver, a previous graduate student of mine. And what Mike did is just make the assumption that the farmer cultivated the field on May 25. Mike went to that field on June 1, and he counted how many water hemp plants came up in the 7 days prior to June 1. And this is a logarithmic scale, so note there would have been about 400 water hemp plants came up between May 25 and June the 1st. So after Mike counted those weeds, he sprayed the entire area with Liberty, killed off any emerged weeds, and then he went back on May 7, and there was about 300 more water hemp plants that came up per square meter. He would spray them off after he finished the count, and you can see there was about 500 that came up between June 7 and June 14. What's really amazing to me is if you go to August 22nd, in the 7 days prior to August 22nd, about 100 water hemp plants still came up per square meter. And notice water hemp is still coming up on October 25, right? And so if you have a weed species on your farm that has an emergence pattern similar to the water hemp that I'm showing, you have to apply a herbicide that has really long residual activity in the soil so that you control all of these flushes of water hemp throughout the entire growing season. In terms of time of germination and emergence, herbicide concentration is reduced due to photochemical and microbial degradation beginning immediately after application. And you have reduced control with herbicides that provide short residual activity in the soil. And the example I'll give you is water hemp and velvet leaf control with Ingenia or Extendamax. And you get poor control of late emerging nightshade and fall panicum with Dual and Frontier. And that's all influenced by the germination and emergence pattern of each individual weed species. I'm not going to talk very much about herbicide resistance. It's a huge problem globally. In Ontario, Canada fleabane, common ragweed, water hemp, and giant ragweed have evolved resistance to glyphosate. I took all of these pictures in farmers' fields, not on the research station. That's the density of glyphosate-resistant weeds that Ontario farmers have to deal with. It's really important that you know that and then adjust your herbicide choice accordingly. And this is just a list of the known herbicide-resistant weeds in the province of Ontario. There's 11 triazine or group 5 resistant weeds, 11 group 2 resistant weeds. There's now 5 glyphosate resistant weeds in the province. So just to show you the impact of herbicide resistance, this is some research by Josh Vine, another graduate student in my program. Josh was looking at water hemp control with atrazine. Notice he sprayed it on a farm near Cottam, Ontario. It happened to be susceptible to atrazine, got 100% control. And then he did the exact same experiment near Petrolia, Ontario. These would be maybe 150 kilometers apart and got no control. That's the impact of herbicide resistance on weed control on the farm. And this is some more recent data. I think this is just amazing. This is research by David Westervelt, another graduate student in my program. Here we're looking at water hemp control. And this water hemp has the mechanism of resistance is enhanced metabolism to the group 5 herbicides. He sprayed Sencor, and look at, he got near perfect control of the water hemp on that farm in Essex County. David did the same experiment on a farm in Lambton County. Water hemp, it's still the same weed, but it has a different mechanism of resistance. It's an altered target site, sprayed the same herbicide at the same rate, and that's the activity that the herbicide provided. So it's just amazing the impact of resistance, and it's amazing depending on what the mechanism of resistance is and herbicide performance on the farm. Now we'll talk about application timing. So in terms of pre-plant herbicides, and so I'm talking about applying a pre-plant herbicide on April 15 in your no-till corn or your soybean. So pre-plant applications in no-till applied too early before seeding results in shorter residual weed control in the crop, and you have reduced late season weed control in no-till corn and soybean. So here you can see to plant or applying it too early with post-emergence herbicides, and post herbicides with no residual activity applied too early before all the weeds have emerged, and you get no control of weeds emerging after application with herbicides like the group 1 herbicides, Assure, Post, Select, Venture, post-contact herbicides for broadleaf weed control, Blazer, Basgram, Partner, and Reflex, and Glyphosate and Liberty. If you look at the picture in the top right-hand corner, I think you would have thought that this is a control plot where no herbicide was applied. That's not the case at all. Roundup was applied in this Roundup Ready corn. This is the impact of weed flushes emerging after the application of Roundup. And as all of you know, Roundup doesn't provide any residual weed control, and so these weeds are not controlled. And so here we did a timing study, and we applied glyphosate at the unifoliate stage, really bad weed control at the end of the summer. Here we applied it at the 3rd trifoliate stage of soybean, and you can see pretty good control. And it's simply because when we applied it later in the season, more of the weeds were up at the time of application, and therefore you got better weed control. Now we'll talk about too late for soil applied herbicides. This is some interesting research that was done by Jim Kells at Michigan State University. He applied dual for giant foxtail control. He applied it pre-emergence in corn, got 100% control. Applied it at the 2-leaf stage of corn, got 99% control. Notice where he delayed the application to when the corn was at the 4-leaf stage, the control decreased from 100 to 80%. And that doesn't surprise me at all. Dual is a really good giant foxtail herbicide. The next thing I'll tell you is if that giant foxtail is, let's say, a 1/4 inch in height, a 1/2 centimeter tall, man, you better spray that giant foxtail that exact same day, because as it gets any size at all, the weed control efficacy drops off dramatically. In terms of too late with post-emergence herbicides, generally, annual weeds are easier to control when they're young and actively growing. And the reason is the cuticle is thinner and the plant is growing actively. And you get reduced control of large weeds with almost all post-emergence herbicides, like the group 1 herbicides, the post-broadleaf herbicides, as well as the group 27s and glyphosate and Liberty. So this is some research that was done by Brendan Metzger, a previous graduate student in my program. Notice when he applied Shieldex plus atrazine for lady's thumb control, when it was 10 centimeters in height or 4 inches in height, he got 93% control. My guess is if that's your farm, you're going to be pretty happy with the control with Shieldex plus atrazine. However, notice where he delayed the application till they were 20 centimeters in height or 8 inches, the control decreased by about 20% to 72%. And when he delayed it till the lady's thumb was 30 centimeters or 12 inches in height, there was another 20% decrease. Man, if you forget everything that I've presented this morning, remember this graph. Small weeds, 10 centimeter weeds, 4-inch weeds are always easier to control with post-emergence herbicides than big weeds. And the herbicide manufacturers know this. I took this statement right off the Reflex label, so I typed it word for word from their label. And so Syngenta tells you, apply Reflex liquid herbicide when weeds are small and actively growing. And they go on to say later applications may result in poor weed control due to advanced weed growth. Lamb's quarters does appear on the Reflex label. I think you'd agree with me. This is really disappointing. Lamb's quarters control with Reflex, and possibly, this isn't one of my experiments, but possibly the herbicide was just applied too late, and that resulted in poor control of the lamb's quarters with Reflex. You need to understand the translocation pattern within a plant throughout the growing season to optimize weed control. And reduced weed control is obtained with glyphosate application made after during the hot summer months. Since quackgrass goes partially dormant and there is reduced translocation to the root system. And if you want to control quackgrass on your farm, the best time to apply quackgrass is either early in the spring or late in the fall, when there's 4 to 5 new leaves on each individual plant. And that's when you will get the best translocation of glyphosate into those underground perenniating plant structures like rhizomes in quackgrass. Really interesting, in perennial broadleaf weeds, it's quite different. It's almost the opposite in terms of the optimal application timing. So prior to flowering, most of the carbohydrate is used to support reproductive growth. And as a result, there's very little downward or basipital translocation into the underground root system. So if you were a perennial broadleaf weed, early in the growing season, you're going to mobilize all of the stored carbohydrates in those perennial plant structures in the roots, and all of the carbohydrate moves up in the plant. Herbicides never direct traffic inside a plant. They merely go along for the ride. And so if carbohydrates are moving up, that's where the herbicide's going to go. That means you get almost no herbicide into that underground perennial root system, and you would get poor control of the Canada thistle on your farm. However, at the early bud to flowering flower stage, there's greater movement of the carbohydrate to the underground structures, and you get reduced control with early applications and better control if you delay it until those perennials have flowered. Now we'll talk about application and seeding problems. And so if you have a herbicide such as Eptam, Treflan, or Prowl, you have to apply them pre-plant incorporated because the herbicide is lost due to volatilization or breakdown by sunlight. However, if you don't incorporate it properly, you could have excessive dilution of the herbicide. If you don't incorporate it immediately, it could be lost due to volatilization or photodegradation. Or if you do it improperly, you could have non-uniform incorporation in the field that results in streaks in the field. I almost never have it that a farmer calls me and says, Peter, come to my farm and I want to show you a mistake I made on my farm. And obviously, Russ Barker is a pretty knowledgeable and confident farmer. And he called me and said, Peter, have a look at my cornfield. And he used a pre-plant incorporated herbicide. And he specifically took me to parts of the field where he had these streaks in the field. And he attributed these streaks in the field to a new cultivator that he had purchased. And he said, I didn't set it up properly. I got non-uniform incorporation of my herbicide. And look at the streaks of weed escapes in the field because the cultivator was not set up properly. So good for that farmer for calling me and asking me to see that in the field. In terms of herbicide placement, depending on what weed you want to control in each individual field, will determine whether you should apply your herbicide pre-emergence or pre-plant incorporated. So if most annual weeds germinate in the top 1 inch or 2.5 centimeters of the soil, and you get reduced weed control with many soil applied herbicides if the herbicide is moved deeper in the soil. For example, Eastern black nightshade would germinate in the top 1 centimeter or let's say ½ inch of the soil. And if you apply these herbicides PPI, you just get poor weed control because you've placed it too deep in the soil profile. But you've got to know what weeds you have in each individual field, and that will determine what's the optimum way to apply the herbicide. So in contrast to that, if you have yellow nutsedge with the exact same 2 herbicides, Dual and Frontier, you're going to get poor control if you apply it pre. So you should apply it PPI, and it's because the tubers from yellow nutsedge are deeper in the soil profile, and you want to place the herbicide deeper in the soil. So you need to adjust the application method depending on the weed species in each individual field. In terms of a herbicide antagonism, tank mixes of some herbicides will result in reduced weed control. Probably the best known example is Basagran antagonizes annual grass control with Post and Select. Classic and First Rate antagonize Assure. Clay-based herbicide formulations antagonize glyphosate. And some foliar fertilizers will also antagonize glyphosate. So this is some research from a colleague of mine, Dr. Clarence Swanton at the University of Guelph. And he was looking at barnyard grass control in soybean. Notice when he put on a tank mix of Assure and Pinnacle, 94% control of the barnyard grass. Really interesting to me, Classic is another sulfonylurea. They're both in the same herbicide family, but when he tank mixed with Classic, the control was reduced by 16%. And you can see here, there's a 46% decrease in control when he tank mixed Assure and First Rate. So just to show you what it looked like in the field. So this is the experiment by Clarence Swanton that I'm referring to. Notice over here, he applied Classic plus Pinnacle plus Assure. And I think you'd all agree with me, that is really disappointing annual grass control. Notice right beside it, this yellow stake here, he applied the same herbicides, Classic, Pinnacle, and Assure. But there's a big difference. And here, instead of a plus sign, I have FB, which means followed by. What Clarence did in this experiment, he applied Classic and Pinnacle 1 week, and then the following week, he applied Assure and got great control of the grasses. Here he applied all 3 herbicides at once and got really disappointing control of the annual grasses. This is some research that we did a number of years ago looking at various foliar fertilizers with glyphosate. This just happens to be one of them. Notice that glyphosate applied by itself provided anywhere from 76, which are the black bar graphs, to 100% control of lamb's quarters, wild mustard, green smartweed, and common ragweed. However, with the addition of this particular foliar fertilizer, the lamb's quarters control went from 76 to 18%, And notice there was a decrease in mustard, green smartweed, and common ragweed control as well. We actually took those experiments to yield. In the glyphosate or Roundup treated plot, we had 171 bushels per acre. Where we added the foliar fertilizer, you can see that there was a decrease of 48 bushels per acre, and that's because of antagonism from the foliar fertilizer. So just keep in mind, the reason why you add a foliar fertilizer is to increase the yield of your corn, not decrease it. So if we round this off, 48 bushels, we'll make it 50 just to do some easy math. And you say that corn sells for $6 a bushel now in Ontario. This farmer lost $300 per acre because he added a foliar fertilizer to the tank. So that's the impact of adding some foliar fertilizers to the tank and the impact on herbicide antagonism and the subsequent decrease in corn yield. Now we'll talk about herbicide rate, and we won't go into this in very much detail because we talked about it earlier, but you have to increase the herbicide rate on fine textured soils that are high in organic matter. You want to increase the rate if you put it on really early, let's say in April compared to June, and you want to increase the rate for weed species that are difficult to control. The Converge label says use the high rate for prosamillet. I would tell you, if you're using atrazine or Sencor, bump up your rate if you're trying to control ragweed or velvet leaf. And even glyphosate, you need to adjust the rate depending on weed species and weed height. I did this research with a colleague of mine, Dr. Rob Nurse at the Agriculture Canada Research Station in Harrow. The blue line is the registered rate of Roundup Weather Max in Ontario. What we are trying to find out is how much Roundup do you need to kill green foxtail, barnyard grass, pigweed, lamb's quarters, and common ragweed. And in our research, green foxtail is the most sensitive to glyphosate. And our data says you only need half a liter to kill green foxtail. Keep in mind, the registered rate is 0.67. So even at a below label rate, you're still going to get 90% control. However, barnyard grass, our data says you need 0.7 liters per acre to kill barnyard grass. You need 0.6 to kill red root pigweed. So if you had these weeds on your farm, you're going to be perfectly happy with the registered rate of Roundup Weather Max. Keep in mind, these weeds were really big when we did this experiment. What I want you to notice, though, is you need twice as much Roundup to kill a 12-inch lamb's quarters than barnyard grass, and you need 5 times as much Roundup to kill a 12-inch common ragweed plant compared to a green foxtail plant. So you need to know what weed species you have in each individual field. You need to know the relative activity of the herbicide on those individual weeds, and then adjust your herbicide rate accordingly. Not only do you have to know what the weed species are in each individual field, you also need to adjust the rate depending on weed height in the field. So here we had a 4-inch lamb's quarters plant, 8-inch, and a 12-inch. And the point that I want to make is that you need 3 times as much Roundup to kill a 12-inch lamb's quarters compared to a 4-inch lamb's quarters. So you need to know what species you have, and you need to know their height, and that will determine what rate of herbicide you should apply. Another reason why you get poor weed control on the farm is you just didn't add the correct tank mix partner. And with some herbicides, there's a really interesting interaction between various herbicide modes of action. And I think the one that's the best documented in the literature is the interaction between group 27 and group 5 herbicides. In this research by John Fluttert, he's a current graduate student of mine, He was looking at glyphosate-resistant Canada fleabane control in corn. Notice that Shield-X by itself was really disappointing. It only gave 34% control. Notice that atrazine by itself gave 79% control, and farmers are not happy with less than 90% weed control. So that's unacceptable. But when you apply these two herbicides together, the control goes up to 94%. So just to show you what it looked like in the field, this is a farmer's field in Ontario. It's not on campus. This is the density of glyphosate-resistant Canada fleabane that this farmer deals with. This is the weedy check. This is the control with Shield-X by itself, not acceptable. And then you add a herbicide like atrazine, partner, or basagran. You go from unacceptable weed control to near perfect weed control, and none of these herbicides, atrazine, partner, or basagran by themselves, would give acceptable control. And so it's really important to follow the label directions. If the label recommends that you tank mix Shield-X with atrazine, make sure you follow that recommendation and you'll get improved weed control on your farm. The next one is herbicide coverage, and thorough herbicide coverage is required for non-translocated post-contact herbicides, and coverage is influenced by nozzle selection, spray pressure, and water carrier volume. So in this research, we compared flat fan nozzles, which are the black bar graph, to air induction nozzles, which are the gray ones. We are looking at the herbicide bromoxynil or partner, and notice when we went to an air induction nozzle, there was a decrease in weed control on all three of these weeds of 9 to 11%. So if you have a contact herbicide, you probably want to use a nozzle that gives you a medium spray droplet and really good coverage on the weeds. We also looked at the air induction nozzles here, so there's no flat fan, but we looked at it at two spray pressures, 70 psi or 490 kilopascals and 40 psi. And notice if you are using an air induction nozzle, make sure that you keep your spray pressure up, or you're going to compromise weed control. And we did this with a number of different herbicides. And so here's weed control in soybean with basagran. We used an air induction nozzle, 70 psi, 20 gallons per acre. I think if this was your farm, you would be disappointed in the weed control. Right beside it, we used a flat fan nozzle, 40 psi, 20 gallons per acre. Look at the impact of herbicide selection on weed control with a post-emergence contact herbicide. With some herbicides, and specifically with Roundup or glyphosate, you get better weed control at lower water carrier volume. And so here we had Roundup applied in 10 gallons per acre, 100 liters per hectare. And on velvet leaf, if you applied it in 20 gallons, your weed control actually went down, just the opposite of what you would have got with partner or basagran. And here you can see the same thing with lady's thumb. You get poorer weed control when you use more water and you have better coverage of the weed. And so the question is why does Roundup, or why is the efficacy of Roundup lower when you use a higher water carrier volume? And the answer is quite straightforward. Glyphosate dissociates in water. It forms a negatively charged molecule. In water, there's magnesium and calcium ions. They have a positive charge. And what happens is the negatively charged glyphosate binds with the positively charged calcium or magnesium ions. That complex is not taken up as efficiently by the plant, and it results in poorer weed control. In terms of adjuvant selection, I just can't impress on you how important it is to use the right adjuvant. This is research by John Fluttert. Here you can see the the gray bar graph is where no adjuvant was added. He added Agro 90. The control of ragweed went from 29 to 75%. but where he used merge, it was even better at 97%. And I just want to stress to you, make sure you read the label, use the adjuvant that's recommended on the label, and you will optimize the activity of that herbicide. This is some pictures that I took of John's research. Here's the weedy control plot, Shieldex plus atrazine. If this was your farm, you would be disappointed in the weed control. Look at the impact of adding $3 of merge. You go from this to this. That's the impact of adding an adjuvant to the herbicide. This last summer, we did some research for one of the companies looking at weed control with clethodim or select. And we added the adjuvant on the label, and we're looking at volunteer corn control. We went from 20 to 93%. What really surprised me is they had two experimental adjuvants, Journey and Strike Lock, and they were actually kind of better than Amigo. And so you can see the control increase to 93 and 97%. What really surprised me is that there was a 2 bushel per acre difference in soybean yield. Soybeans are approaching $20 a bushel today in Ontario. Just by using the right adjuvant, you're making $40 more per acre. So that's the impact of adjuvant selection on weed control and on subsequent crop yield. We've evaluated the activity of 13 different herbicides now in terms of the time of day, impact on weed control. And our research indicates that the control with many post-emergence herbicides is reduced when applied very early in the morning or very late at night. So here we're looking at Liberty. Liberty has a bigger time of day effect than any other herbicide we've worked on. And the weed control is up to 32% different between spraying at 3 o'clock in the afternoon and at midnight. Who would have ever thought that a 9-hour difference in the application timing of the herbicide would have a 32% difference in weed control? And so you can see we had poor weed control when we sprayed at 6 o'clock in the morning. It went up to 93% at 9 o'clock. We had the best weed control between noon and 6 p.m., and then it went down again. And just to show you what it looked like in the field, this is pretty amazing. Here's the weedy check, and you can't even see any ground between the corn rows. Notice at 6 o'clock in the morning, there's lots of weeds between that corn row, between those corn rows. And compare that to 12 noon, 3 p.m. and 6 p.m. And we have near perfect weed control with Liberty. And then once again, when we delayed the application till midnight, really poor control. So if you're using a post-contact herbicide on your farm, think Liberty, Basagran, Partner, Blazer, Reflex, herbicides like that. They have a pretty pronounced time of day effect. And once again, we took these trials to yield. There was a 48 bushel per acre difference where we applied at noon compared to midnight. So once again, that's $300 an acre at the price of corn today. I just can't stress enough. If you're going to use Liberty, spray it during the hottest sunlit hours of the day. And I always like it when I chat with farmers. And then this farmer, Dave Hooker, nice guy, he said, Peter, I heard you talk about a time of day effect with herbicides. He said, I put on a desiccant. He wasn't looking at weed control on his soybean, and he sprayed the first tank at 8 o'clock at night after supper. And he sent me this picture and said, notice the poor activity of Aragon where I sprayed at 8 o'clock at night. I finished spraying the field the next day at 11 o'clock in the morning. And here the herbicide has been on less time than here. Notice the improved dry down of the crop just because of time of day. So I say adjust the herbicide application timing during the day based on the herbicide. Apply the post-contact herbicides during the warmest sunlit hours of the day. And systemic herbicides like Roundup don't have the same impact of time of day. I'm going to finish my presentation with just talking about herbicide choice. And each herbicide has its strengths and weaknesses. And it's really important to match the herbicide to the weed spectrum in each individual field. And I'm just going to give you some examples of that. So here, I'm just took two different pictures. These are weed escapes with Sencor or metribuzin. You can see velvet leaf escapes on the left-hand side and ragweed escapes on the right-hand side. Some of you online might be thinking, wow, Peter, that's not very nice of you showing such poor activity with Sencor, and that's sold by, or metribuzin sold by lots of different companies. And I would say to you, that's exactly what I would expect. We know that metribuzin is not that good on velvet leaf and ragweed. If you have those weeds in your soybean field, use a different herbicide. And so you think velvet leaf, boy, Pursuit's a pretty good velvet leaf herbicide. If you don't have sensitive crops in the rotation, that would have been a much better choice. If you don't have group 2 resistant common ragweed, my guess is if you applied First Rate in your soybean, there wouldn't be any ragweed plants there at all. You need to know what weeds you have in each individual field and then match the herbicide to the weed spectrum in the field. Here's lamb's quarters escapes with First Rate applied post-emergence. And once again, super disappointing weed control. And I would just say to you, that's exactly what you would expect from that herbicide. They don't claim control of lamb's quarters on the label. If you had lamb's quarters in your soybean post-emergence, maybe you would use a herbicide like Pinnacle, which is much better on lamb's quarters than First Rate is. Here you can see Eastern Black Nightshade escapes with Pinnacle. Pinnacle has no activity on it. Use Pursuit instead of Pinnacle. I think this is an amazing picture. It was an experiment by Clarence Swanton. This is Roundup Ready soybean. And I can remember I just stopped dead in my tracks when I was looking at this experiment by Clarence. I think it's really good research. I have rarely seen Roundup Ready soybean, other than when you have glyphosate resistant weeds, provide such poor weed control. And guess what? Roundup's not really that good on wild buckwheat, common mallow, and black medic. And those were the weed escapes in this particular experiment. So this is one of my favorite pictures. It's a picture that I took in a farmer's field in Ontario. And when you look at this picture, and I'm going to just stop for a second, you don't have to unmute yourself, but what do you see in that picture? And I think it's just an amazing picture. Notice you have a grass plant here that's perfectly alive, right? And then you have a grass plant here that's dying, and this one's already turned brown. These are just going to turn brown, dry up, and blow away. And right beside it, you have a living grass plant. And so the question is, why did that happen in this farmer's field? And it's really important that you know weed identification. This happens to be a green foxtail. This happens to be a ragweed, and it's excellent control of green foxtail, as you can see here, and poor control of crabgrass, as you can see here with the herbicide Steadfast. And once again, that is exactly what you would expect from this herbicide. The herbicide label claims control of green foxtail. They do not claim control of crabgrass. So thank you very much. And if you have any questions at all at this time, I'd be more than happy to try to address them.
Thank you so much, Dr. Sikkema. I know this hour is short and then lots of great information for you to remember. Luckily, we record this section, and the record video we post on YouTube channel, our YouTube channel shortly after we edit it. And you can always go back to find those great information for your management. I'm not going to say too much. I will show my end slide and tell you the information I want to share. But today I'm going to address all the questions from the chat to you. Are you okay to stay a little bit longer, Dr. Sikkema, to address those questions?
I have nothing concrete plan for the afternoon. I obviously have lots of work, but I can stay as long as there's questions.
Okay, everyone hears that. You can send in your question as much as you want. Okay, thank you. I will. Okay, Talia, please.
Yes, let's dive in here. Okay, so question number one, with the concern, oh, I'm sorry, my scroll bar just is misbehaving here. There we go. Okay, so with the concern about applying herbicides on soil with certain amounts of organic matter, for example, broadstrike, is the concern reduced weed control, increased herbicide persistence, or both?
Yeah, and so in terms of increased organic matter, as you go from a sand to a clay texture, or to a clay textured soil, or if you have low pH, in all of those, you're going to have reduced weed control, and that would be the concern. Having said that, soil characteristics for sure impact the persistence of herbicides as well. It's really detailed information, but a herbicide like Pursuit is more persistent on a low pH soil. Really interesting. You would get greater persistence and more injury to rotational crops on a high pH soil with a herbicide like Classic or Atrazine. And so the point that I want to make is that herbicide carryover is influenced by soil characteristics, and it's unique for each active ingredient.
Okay, that's great. And at any point, feel free, if you want to sort of expand on your question, you can just pop that into the chat and we can kind of expand on that. Next question here. So is the interaction between glyphosate and clay-based formulations affected by the application rate of the clay-based herbicide, or is it a general effect even at low rates for the clay-based herbicide?
Yeah, and I would think the higher the rate of the clay-based herbicides, the greater the antagonism, and you can overcome that antagonism by increasing the rate of glyphosate. And so, yeah, if you would like to tank mix with a clay-based herbicide, which is a problem, but if you do, you could overcome that antagonism by increasing the rate of Roundup by 25 or 50%.
Okay, fabulous. Are the experimental adjuvants for Select available on the market?
So those two adjuvants are currently in development by Winfield United. And so we evaluated them for the first time in 2021. And in my discussions with them, they are currently in process trying to get them registered in Canada.
Okay, great. Will herbicide resistance improve if the herbicide was not used for a number of years?
The answer to that is it depends. And I don't want to sound like I'm a government employee and won't give you a straight answer. For most herbicide resistance, once you have it on your farm, if there's no fitness penalty associated with that herbicide, it's going to remain there indefinitely into the future. And so whoever farms that piece of land 2, 3, 4, 5 generations in the future will continue to have herbicide resistant biotypes on that farm. They will not shift back to the sensitive or susceptible biotype. There's only a few examples where there's a fitness penalty associated with herbicide resistance. Probably the best example is triazine-resistant lamb's quarters. There is a fitness penalty. That plant doesn't grow as well. So it's not as big, it's not as robust, doesn't set as much seed. And so over time, if you never used atrazine on those farms, it would shift back to the susceptible biotype. That's unusual in weed science. Most of the time, it's never going to shift back to the susceptible biotype, but there are some exceptions, and I just gave you one.
That's great. Thanks, Dr. Sikkema.
So nobody has to call me Dr. Sikkema. Peter's good. Yeah.
All right, we can do that.
Yeah.
So how do you know which foliar fertilizers affect glyphosate efficacy? So is it a certain element in the foliar fertilizer, or is it some other component?
Yeah, and I don't have a good answer. And so I think the foliar fertilizers, they are foliar fertilizer blend specific in terms of whether or not they antagonize glyphosate. I think any foliar fertilizer that has positively charged cations in it, whether that be manganese, calcium, iron, and so on, those positively charged ions will complex with glyphosate. That complex is not taken up as efficiently by the plant, and that's why you get reduced weed control with some, and I want to stress the word some, with some foliar fertilizers. We have evaluated a range of foliar fertilizers in our program, and there are some foliar fertilizers that are perfectly safe to tank mix with Roundup glyphosate, and you will not compromise weed control. And then I showed you the extreme, the other way, where you have a dramatic negative impact on weed control with some foliar fertilizers.
Mm-hmm.
And so it's foliar fertilizer specific.
Okay. Let me see what else we've got here. If there's any other questions, don't hesitate to pop them in the chat here. Okay, so thinking of these new varieties of sweet corn and applying very early post, what would the best water volume be to use with Primextra and Callisto mixed with Roundup? So they call for very different amounts on their labels individually. This particular person follows sweet corn with winter wheat, so they're not concerned with herbicide carrying over affecting the veg crop.
Yeah, that's a super hard question. And so, you know, obviously glyphosate, you're going to have improved activity at a lower water carrier volume. With atrazine, you're going to get better activity. So I think it was Primextra Callisto, right? So you have dual, so you have metolachloroatrazine and mesotrione in the mix. And so with atrazine, probably because it's only apoplastically translocated, you'd have improved control at a higher water carrier volume. So that's a really tough compromise. If it was me and it was my farm, and if you have a really good water source, and by water source, I mean water that has, it's a low in terms of its hardness. Let's say you have a water that's less than 100 parts per million water hardness. I would be perfectly comfortable going up to 20 gallons of water per acre. In contrast to that, we have water sources in Ontario where the water hardness is over 1,500 parts per million. And that's where you would really see a reduction in the activity of the glyphosate. So if you have good water, I'd probably go to the 20 gallons per acre.
Okay, that's great. Thank you, Peter. Are there conditions where the wax layer of a weed will increase above normal?
Yes, really good question. And so under hot, dry conditions, right, that plant wants to conserve moisture, right, because it is hot and dry. And the way that a plant conserves moisture is two ways. It closes the stomates and it increases the thickness of the cuticle on the leaf surface. And so cuticle thickness actually varies a lot during the summer based on the age of the weed and based on the weather conditions prior to the herbicide application. So if you had cool, overcast weather in the 7 days prior to applying a post herbicide, chances are you're going to get pretty good weed control. In contrast to that, if you had really hot, dry conditions in the 7 days before putting on a post herbicide, man, the cuticle is going to be thicker and your weed control is going to be reduced.
Yeah, that makes sense. We've got another one here. Could you comment on the potential for soil activity from post-grass herbicides like Venture or Post?
Wow, what good question. Anyways, so embarrassingly, I've taught weed science since I think 1993, 1994 is when I first taught it. And I would say for the first 15, 20 years that I taught weed science, so Venture is a group 1 herbicide. And in my lecture notes, it would have said that Venture, the group 1 herbicides, have no activity in the soil at all, right? That would have been what I taught all of my students, and I taught them incorrectly for 20 years. So I want to acknowledge that. Much to my surprise, I went to a farm north of Chatham, Ontario. I'm going to say it was about 10 years ago. And what happened on that farm, and just one second, I got to clear my throat. So what happened on that farm is the seed dealer gave him the wrong corn hybrid. And let's say it was a 2,000 crop heat unit hybrid and he needs 3,000, right? And so he was going to have way lower yield because the seed dealer sent him the wrong hybrid. Good for the seed dealer. They were honest about it and said, boy, we made a mistake. And the corn was already up. And so what they did is they sprayed the whole field with Venture. And then the next day, they planted the appropriate hybrid, let's say 3 or 4 inches beside the first hybrid that was planted. And I was absolutely shocked. The hybrid that was planted after the herbicide was applied. So the only way it was taken up was through the soil and through the roots. So the hybrid that was planted after the herbicide was applied, Venture in this case, it came up and, you know, it looked pretty good, but it had noticeable white bleaching on the leaves. And so it clearly showed that there is short residual activity from the group 1 herbicides. I think Post has almost no residual activity in the soil. And then I think Select, Venture, and Assure have a little bit more in terms of residual activity. To answer or to expand on my answer, if that farmer called me next year and said, I got the wrong hybrid, my corn's up, and I want to burn it off and then plant back to corn because I already put on my Acuron or whatever, and he can't go to soybean, you know what? I would still recommend it. I think it is really unusual to get that root uptake of a group 1 herbicide. The next thing I'll say, it can happen, and it's very few and far between.
Okay, that's great.
That's a long answer, sorry.
We're getting a lot in here. We're very appreciative of that. Next question. So could you comment on the group 27 and group 5 synergism when using tank mixtures of these herbicide groups versus sequential applications?
Am I ever glad that whoever asked that question, right? I mean, it's one of my favorite explanations in weed science, and I will do my very best to make it as clear as I can, but I will say the reason is really technical. But anyways, if you have atrazine or a group 5 herbicide, what happens when you spray atrazine on a weed, it stops electron transport in the plant. You have these high energy electrons that ultimately form reactive oxygen species that break cell membranes. So make sure you're sticking with me. You spray atrazine, you get reactive oxygen species, break cell membranes. That's why the lamb's quarters on your farm dies when you spray atrazine. Now, when you spray a group 27 herbicide, they are carotenoid biosynthesis inhibitors. They stop the production of tocopherols and plastoquinone in the plant. I know I'm getting technical on you, but tocopherols, plastoquinone, carotenoids, they quench reactive oxygen species. So I don't know if you can see my hands when I'm talking here. Can you, is my picture on?
You're going to want to raise your hands a little. Yeah, there you go.
so I can't see I don't see my own picture. So just think about it. Atrazine increases reactive oxygen species in the plant, and the group 27s reduce the ability of the plant to deal with reactive oxygen species. So the reason why you have the interaction is it's 1 + 1 = 5 when you tank mix a group 5 and a group 27 herbicide. And the biochemical explanation is really clear. One increases reactive oxygen species, the other reduces the ability of the weed to deal with reactive oxygen species. And that's why 1 + 1 = 5.
Yeah, that was a great explanation. Thank you for making sense of all that. So I think that was the last of the open questions. So thank you so much. Hope we didn't.
No, it's
use that
all
for
good.
too much,
All
but
good.
yeah.
Thank you. Yeah, I don't see any more question on the Q&A or the chats now. So thank you so much for staying longer, and all the knowledge you share with us today is great. Thank you.
And so for the 60 participants online, if any of you are interested in the Weed Science short course, I see that Hugh put my email address in the chat. Please feel free to email me and I will send you some information on the course. I thoroughly enjoy teaching it.
Yeah. I'm going to copy and paste the information. Oh, did you just do it? Okay, perfect. Thank you. Yeah. Peter's email is shown there. So if you want to take the course, please contact Peter directly. And I'm sure you're going to get more knowledge in today's section. So lots of great information. Yeah, thank you. Okay, so we are going to end today's presentation. As I say, if you want to watch this record video, maybe a couple of days after, we will have this video post on our YouTube channel. Yeah, thank you. Thanks everyone.
Thank you very much, Hugh, for the invitation to speak.
Thanks, Peter. Thank you. Yeah, great presentation. Thank you.
Yeah. Thanks a lot.
Okay, bye.
Enjoy your day.